It's Monday. I almost forgot about you. I was like, it's time to go to bed. No, it's not. It's time to read. Anyway, I didn't forget. And here I am, chapter 17, in which they get out of the caves and into even more trouble. And we just read, see, I'm not forgetting this week. We just read, the Quazzle tried to attack them, make the cave fall in on top of them. And then Daystar used the sword, and the flat of the sword hit the rock, and then all the rocks went away, and there was some noise and exciting things, and then the Quazzle was dead. And then the dwarves who had arrived to potentially clear the cave-in that was blocking their way out, they said, "Why didn't you mention that you had the sword?" So that's what just happened. Okay. Shiera and I looked at the dwarves. "He's been holding it since before you got here," Shiera said finally. "Why should he have mentioned it?" "It would have saved a lot of bother," one of the female dwarves said in an aggrieved tone. "Time, too," said another. "Inconsiderate, I call it." "Well, not inconsiderate exactly," said one of the male dwarves, eyeing the dragon. "A little thoughtless, maybe." "Thoughtless?" The dragon looked puzzled. "Why? What difference does it make if Daystar has a sword?" "A sword is one thing. That sword is something else again. Someone should have told us. Someone definitely should have told us. After all, we aren't elves." "Of course you're not elves," the dragon said. "Anyone could see that. What does this have to do with Daystar's sword?" "It's not his sword," one of the dwarves objected. "It's the king's." "And elves can recognize it just by looking at it," a female dwarf said in a resentful tone. "So can some people," said another darkly, "but not dwarves. Unless we get a good look at it, of course, which we couldn't because of the light, not to mention the fact that you were standing there talking and distracting our attention. Which is why you should have mentioned it," a dwarf in the back finished triumphantly. "I didn't mention it because there seem to be a lot of people who want it," I said. "One of them is a wizard." About 6 of the dwarves started talking so fast it was hard to tell whether they were all speaking at the same time or whether they went one after another. "Of course there are a lot of people who want it, particularly wizards. It is the king's sword, isn't it?" "Maybe it isn't. He hasn't said." "It has to be the king's sword, silly. There aren't any other swords the earth obeys." "What about Delvin's blade?" "That's not a sword, it's an axe." "And the earth doesn't obey it, it just shakes a lot." "So it has to be the king's sword." "Wait a minute," I said. "What do you know about my sword?" "It's the king's sword," one of the dwarfs said indignantly. Another dwarf shushed him, and a dwarf near the front of the crowd stepped forward and bowed. "We follow the sword," she said, as if it explained everything. The other dwarfs all smiled and nodded. I sighed and gave up. Either none of them really knew anything else, or they knew and weren't going to tell me, and I didn't think it mattered much which it was. "If you aren't going to tell me about my sword, could one of you do something about Shiera's arm?" I asked, "and after that we'll be going." "Going where?" the dragon said. Some of the dwarves jumped. Evidently they'd forgotten the dragon was behind them. I was surprised. If a dragon were standing behind me, I certainly wouldn't forget it was there. "We have to find another way out of the Caves of Chance," I told the dragon. "I don't really think we can dig through this one." "That will not be necessary," said the dwarf closest to me. "Had we known you were the bearer of the sword, we would not have objected to your request." "Not at all," said the dwarf next to him. She turned and waved at the others. "Lord Daystar requires this tunnel cleared. Begin." I stood and stared while the dwarves all grabbed their picks and shovels and things and started toward the rocks that were blocking the tunnel. In a few minutes they were all digging furiously, except for one who came over to Shiera and bowed. "I am Darlbrin," he announced. "That's nice," Shiera said sarcastically. I sighed, but I didn't say anything. You can't really expect a fire witch with a broken arm to be particularly polite. Darlbrin didn't seem to notice. "I have some skill at mending things," he said, and bowed again. "If you will permit it, I would like to examine your arm." He looked at Shiera a shade anxiously and added, "To see if I can mend it." Shiera rolled her eyes, but she walked over to the edge of the tunnel and sat down so the dwarf could see better. Nightwitch followed, alternately purring reassuringly and meowing anxiously. I watched for a minute or two, then turned away. I couldn't do anything to help, and I wanted to think. I didn't get the chance. As soon as I turned, the dragon stuck his head over a couple of dwarves and said, "I didn't know you were a lord. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I'm not a lord," I said. I think I sounded a little desperate, and I know I felt desperate. I didn't have the slightest idea what was going on, except it had something to do with my sword. Everything seemed to have to do with my sword. I was getting tired of it, and more than a little worried. Well, if you want a lord, why do they call you one? Because he has the king's sword, said a dwarf who was walking under the dragon's chin with a boulder more than half as big as he was. The dragon pulled its head back far enough to eye the dwarf, who ignored it and kept walking. I really wish you'd explain a little more, I yelled after the dwarf, and then I thought of something. Why did you call me the bearer of the sword? I didn't call you anything, the dwarf said without stopping. That was Cottlestone. He set the boulder down and headed back toward the pile of rocks, which was beginning to look smaller already. Excuse me, I said loudly, in the general direction of the crowd of dwarves, but would one of you tell me which of you is Cottlestone? I'd like to talk to him, please. Cottlestone! Shouted half a dozen voices. For a minute I thought the roof was going to cave in, but all that actually happened was that one of the dwarves stepped out of the crowd and bowed to me. He looked as if he really meant it, and nodded as if he were just being polite. Don't do that, I said. As you wish, the dwarf said, bowing again. What do you want to know from me? Why did you call me the bearer of the sword? Cottlestone looked surprised. It's obvious. When the bearer of the sword holds the king's sword, the earth obeys it. So, when you held up the sword and the earth obeyed, we knew you were the bearer of the sword. Oh. I thought for a moment. Have you ever heard of the holder of the sword, or the wielder of the sword? Who? Never mind, I said. How does someone get to be the bearer of the sword? No one knows, Cottlestone said, looking at me curiously. Oh, I said again. I was trying to think of something else to ask when there was a shout from the top of the caved-in section of the tunnel. Cottlestone bowed again. If you will excuse me, I think they've gotten through to the other side. I ought to go help. It's my job. All right, I said uncomfortably. Cottlestone turned away, and I watched him melt into the crowd of dwarves. I wasn't sure what I'd found out, except that I didn't like people bowing to me. I found myself hoping that the rest of the dwarves wouldn't imitate Cottlestone. Did he say they're almost finished? Asked Shiera from behind me. Wonderful! I can't wait to get out of here. I turned. Shiera was standing, holding Nightwitch in the crook of her left arm. Her right arm was covered from her fingers almost to her shoulder in something smooth and gray and shiny. She looked a little white, but that might have been the torchlight. Well, what are you staring at? She demanded. I wasn't staring, I said. I was just checking to see if you were all right. Darlbrun stepped up beside Shiera and bowed. Not quite all right, but not bad at all. I wouldn't call a broken arm not bad, Shiera said sourly. Oh, I didn't mean that, Darlbrun said hastily. I was referring to the mending. I'm sure you did a very good job, I told him, and I really appreciate it. I suppose I do too, Shiera mumbled. Thanks. It isn't really mended yet, you know, Darlbrun said with a touch of anxiety. People aren't as easy to fix as axe handles. It'll be a month before you can take the sheath off. Yes, I know. I've had a broken arm before. Shiera scowled at the sheath. Then you're very welcome, the dwarf beamed. Happy to be of service. Shiera snorted, but quietly. Darlbrun didn't notice. He bowed to each of us and went off to help the rest of the dwarves finish clearing the tunnel. I looked at Shiera. I didn't know you'd broken your arm before. That's because I didn't tell you about it, Shiera said. She looked at me for a minute, then sighed. I was stealing apples from the prince's garden and fell out of the tree, all right? Oh, what prince, and why were you taking his apples? The prince of the ruby throne, Shiera said. I did say ruby, right, ruby. The prince of the ruby throne, Shiera said after a minute. He had a house and garden just outside town, and he never picked any of the apples. He just left them to rot, and I was hungry. So I sneaked over the wall and climbed the tree, but there was a big snake in it with wings, so I fell out of the tree and broke my arm, and the snake went away. Shiera, I said, and stopped. She obviously had no idea what she had almost done. I sighed and changed what I was going to say. Shiera, the Prince of the Ruby Throne raises magic apples. All kinds of people have been trying to steal them for years and years, but he's a very powerful sorcerer, and there are hundreds of spells protecting his gardens. That must be why he was so upset, Shiera said, in a tone of sudden enlightenment. I'm pretty sure he was the one who told the Society of Wizards about me. I thought it was a lot of fuss to make about a few apples. I looked at her for a minute. I don't want to be nosy or anything, but I'd really appreciate knowing if there's anyone else who's mad at you. I don't think so, Shiera said, frowning. Good. I don't think I want any more people chasing us, particularly people with powerful magic. It wouldn't be so bad if you could use your fire magic." "She can," said the dragon, and Shiera and I both jumped and turned around. "She burned the dragon's bane, and she can make her hair burn." "When did you see Shiera's hair burning?" I asked. The only time I'd ever seen Shiera's hair on fire was when she'd gotten mad at me right after we'd met, and the dragon hadn't been there then. "Just a few minutes ago," the dragon said. "You were fighting that dessert thing, so you might not have noticed." I looked at Shiera and she blushed. "I was trying to do something to the Quazzle. I thought it would work because it worked on the dragon's bane." "It worked on the dragon's bane," I repeated slowly. "And that first wizard, the one who made a water monster out of the stream. You did something to that monster, too. That's at least twice that you've made your fire magic work properly. Can you think of any others? Maybe we can figure out why it happens." "She used it at the invisible castle," the dragon offered. "The one where the other fire witch lived." "I did not," Shiera said. "I didn't have time. We ran at the castle and she came out and bang, I was a statue." The dragon sat back looking smug. "You said you wanted to know what the castle was, and then you did. That's fire magic, isn't it?" "I suppose it is," Shiera said slowly. "Then that's 3, I said. "Can you think of any more? Before you came to the Enchanted Forest, for instance?" Shiera frowned and was silent. "No," she said finally in a very positive tone. "Those are the only times I've ever gotten my magic to do what I wanted it to. Ever." "So it's only been happening since you came to the Enchanted Forest," I said. "And met you and got bitten by that stupid sword," Shiera added, and stopped. We looked at each other for a minute. "Not again," I said. I thought for a minute. "It can't be the sword alone, or you would have been able to do something to the Quazzle. There has to be something else, too." "Like what?" "I don't know. Did you do anything differently when it worked?" "No." "Well, then did you do anything differently right before it worked?" I said. "There has to be some—" I stopped, remembering. "Oh," I said. "What is it?" "I think I know what makes your magic work." I didn't think Shiera was going to like it very, very much, but I couldn't just keep quiet about it. "I think you have to be polite to people." "That's stupid." "It makes sense," I said. "You apologized to me right after we got out of the hedge, and then when the first wizard came along, your magic worked against the snake thing. You were nice to the princess because you felt sorry for her, and right after that, you knew about the invisible castle. And you said thanks to Suz and apologized to Telemaine, and then you made the dragon's bane burn." "But that other fire witch wasn't polite," Shiera objected. "I didn't say all fire witches have to be polite to people before their magic will work," I said. "I only said your magic works that way, and I'm not positive. I mean, it could be something else." "Well, I'm not going to go around being nice to people just so I can do magic." "I don't think it would work anyway," I said unhappily. "I mean, I don't think you can just say things. I think you have to really mean them. You meant it when you apologized to me, and when you were nice to the princess, and when you were talking to Telemaine." "Oh, great," Shiera said disgustedly. "I bet this is all that stupid sword's fault." She glared at me for an instant, then turned her back. I sighed. "Excuse me, Lord Daystar," said a voice by my elbow. I looked down, and the dwarf bowed. "Don't do that," I said. "Certainly, my lord," she said, and started to bow again, then stopped and looked confused. "The tunnel is clear. You may continue your journey whenever you wish." I looked around. The pile of rocks that had been blocking the tunnel was nearly gone. A few boulders were left along the sides, but there was plenty of room to walk through, even for the dragon. "Thank you very much," I said, "but I really ought to tell you. I'm not a lord." The dwarf smiled tolerantly. "Of course not, my lord. Is there anything else we can do for you?" "I'd appreciate it if we could borrow one of your torches," I said. "Our lamp got lost in the cave-in." "We would be pleased to offer you a torch," the dwarf said. "You can leave it by the exit, and someone will get it later. The exit isn't far." We gathered up what we could find of Morwen's bundles, and the dwarves did some more bowing. One of them handed Shiera a torch. She grumbled a little because she had to put Night Witch down in order to take it, but she was the only one of us who could carry it. I had the sword in one hand and the key in the other, and the dragon couldn't hold a torch. Fortunately, Night Witch didn't seem to mind walking. We thanked the dwarves and said goodbye, and they all bowed again, and we finally started off. The tunnel started slanting upward almost as soon as we were past the cave-in, and shortly after that we stopped seeing side passages. Eventually, we came to a wide flight of stairs that curled around and around until all of us were dizzy. Just when I didn't think I could climb any more, the stairs ended against a hard, rocky surface, like a trap door made of stone. I shoved against it, but it didn't budge. It's too heavy. Really? Said the dragon. It doesn't look so bad. I looked down at the dragon, who was last on the stairs, because neither Shiera nor I had wanted to be behind it if it slipped. That sounds smart. It probably isn't too heavy for you. Why don't you try it? The dragon agreed, and Shiera and I squashed ourselves against the side of the stairs so it could climb past us. There were a couple of minutes' worth of grunts, and the dragon's tail whipped back and forth, which made Shiera and me retreat farther back down the stairs. Finally, there was a loud noise like extremely rusty hinges, and the dragon started moving upward. A moment later, it stopped. "Uh-oh," it said. "What's the matter?" Shiera called. The dragon didn't answer, but it moved out of the way so we could climb up. Shiera and I got to the head of the stairs at almost the same time and looked around. We were standing at the top of a small rise. The sun was starting to set, but there was still enough light to see the castle clearly. It was quite close, not more than a few minutes' walk from where I was, and it fascinated me. At first, I thought it was made of something shimmery, like mother of pearl. Then I realized that it wasn't the castle that was shimmering, it was something around the castle, like a giant soap bubble. I was still trying to figure out what it was when Shiera poked me, and I looked down. There were approximately 200 dragons sitting on the ground around the little hill we were standing on, watching us. Dun, dun, dun. That's the end of chapter 17. And the next chapter, chapter 18, is in which the King of Dragons does some explaining. So it sounds like we finally get to meet Kazul, the King of the Dragons, who, of course, is a female dragon because King is the name of a job. So I'm really looking forward to this part because the action is really starting to speed up. And this is such a good book. So, and I have some really good news for my students who are watching. We just got these books in our library. So you can go check them out. I think someone checked this one out today. But if you want to check out the other ones when we're done reading or even before we're done reading, then they are in there. And remember, the author's name is Patricia Reed. So if you want to find these books, you go to the fiction section and you look under F for fiction, W-R-E for read, because it starts with W. So, yeah, I'll see you next time for chapter 18. Have a great night, everybody. Bye.